Hello, and a welcome from Sydney. I'm Alastair Pennycook, and I'm talking to you from my office at the University of Technology in Sydney. It's a pleasant, sunny afternoon here. We're in about the end of June. It's winter, but warm and sunny, or reasonably warm. Anyway, when Hugh asked me to talk a little do a talk for his website, I thought through a number of different possibilities. I could give a lecture or give a very informal talk. In the end, I thought what I'd try to do is to talk through some of the work I've done really over the last almost 20 years, to try and explain a little of how I see the different directions I've gone, the kind of work I've done. So I thought what I'd do is talk through the different books I've written briefly, and to try and give a sense of how what my work has tried to address and why I've done it in particular ways. So let me go back to the first book I wrote, which is this. This is The Cultural Politics of English as an International Language, which I wrote in 1994, or was published in 1994. That book came out of a dissatisfaction for me that I'd been working as an English teacher in a number of different countries around the world. Most recently, before I wrote that, I'd been working in China for a number of years, before that in Japan and so on. And to me, it seemed that so much of the discussion about English language teaching was about methodology, about grammar, about the nature of English or the nature of teaching. And I thought, okay, these things are, of course they matter. We need to understand English. We need to understand how to teach. But it seemed to me to lack a much more critical dimension that was asking, what are we involved in when we're engaged in English language teaching? And an argument that I made around that time, and I still make now, is that sometimes as English teachers we've said, actually our work is quite difficult, enough, I don't want to have a whole lot more to deal with, I'm just an English teacher. And the point I made around that time was that we're never just an English teacher. In two ways. One is that there's no such thing as just English. English comes with all sorts of baggage and issues and politics and economics and so on. It's never just English, as if it's just a language made up of words and grammar. We're also never just teachers, in the sense that when we teach, we're always involved with a whole set of ideas about how we want students to behave, what we see as the preferences for their learning outcomes. We're really moral and political activists as educators. So within that, I was trying to say, okay, how do we then understand English language teaching within that rather broader view of English and teaching? What I wanted to do then was bring a sense of politics to English language teaching. Now, by politics, I don't mean party politics. This is conservative or Labour or Republican or Democratic and so on. It's more to do with questions of power. What seemed to me was I didn't necessarily want to assume, as some others have done, that English language teaching is necessarily a tool of particular dominant forces. Or at least that became more evident to me as I worked through this. That on the one hand, of course, English is very much tied up with globalization, and that's become very evident in the last 10 years, more so in a sense than when I was working on that book. But you'd also see many ways in which English was resisted and taken up and used by other people. And so the question for me was then not just to insist that English was an imposition and so on, but to try and understand what I call the cultural politics, that it always was a question of difference, of inequality, of these questions of power that are embedded in the idea of cultural politics. So we can never take it out of questions of power, but it was we had to then investigate that at a quite local level to understand it, and not to assume that English was in some way necessarily dominant, necessarily problematic, and so on. Even though I think we always do need to look very critically at those relationships between English and globalization, and English and other languages, as we know, and that's a very important issue of the role that English takes in relationship to other languages. So in that first book, I was really trying to lay that out and say, here, this is how we can maybe start to think about what I saw as a more critical way of understanding English language teaching within a larger global context. And I think since that time, a lot of others have written and talked about this too, and I think we've got a better understanding of that now. It's become more accepted, as we can't just focus down on English teaching. We have to see that as part of a much broader set of relationships that we're involved in. That was my first book. Just after I'd written, a bit later, I moved to Hong Kong and to take up a job at the University of Hong Kong. And one of the things I've written about in that earlier book, I wanted to look at a particular context, so I decided to look at Singapore and Malaysia, because they're very interesting in that they were conjoined and have very similar, in some ways, histories. But what we saw with this strong difference in that Malaysia, for a whole set of complex reasons, and I won't go into that here, had pushed English out of the curriculum to some extent, and since then it's gone back and forth, and in a number of years ago it then reintroduced English very controversially for the teaching of science and technology, and then has then gone back on that. Malaysia is always struggling with relationship to English, partly because of the complex makeup of the society and so on. Singapore, meanwhile, have very much adopted English as it was seen as the second language, but has become very much the first language in another way of a lot of people. I won't go into all that today. There's a huge amount to be written about Singapore and Malaysia. But one of the other things I also looked at in trying to understand that was to look at the colonial history, to say, how do we understand then that background of British colonialism in relationship to the spread of English? It's very obvious that in some way the spread of English has its origins in the British Empire. It also became fairly clear that that was, again, quite a complex issue, that the British certainly didn't push English. I'd assumed much more that they promoted English. In fact, they were quite content or quite concerned, actually, about limiting access to English, because they felt that it was much better to educate people to a limited extent, often at primary level, in local languages, and therefore to limit English. It was a language of power, and they didn't want too many people to have access to it. And it was actually often local people, local elites in particular, who then said, no, actually, if English is going to play this dominant role in a colonial society, we want access to them. That interest in colonialism came very much to the fore for me when I moved to Hong Kong. This was in the 1990s and before Hong Kong was returned to China. It struck me it was a very colonial existence. I should have realized that before I went. I've been to Hong Kong a number of times before, particularly when I lived in China. But what seemed to me very interesting was the way in which debates around English language teaching and so on in Hong Kong seemed to echo and never change in ways. It was the same old thing again. And I started reading back through the colonial archives, and you'd find debates and discussions from, say, the early 20th century that were being replayed in very similar ways 80, 90 years later. So I started to think about that, and that's when I started writing my next book called English and the Discourses of Colonialism. So that focused very much on that colonial history of English, and with a very particular focus on Hong Kong and China, and which is an interesting relationship to China, because of course it's not a colony of Britain. What I was really trying to argue around in that book was trying to understand how it is that these these ways of thinking get repeated and replayed? How is it that at this point in time, somehow these images of other people, images of English, are somehow reproduced and recreated and go on being so? What became very clear to me, and one of the things I wrote about quite a lot in that, and I've actually gone back and rewritten something about that quite recently, was the ways in which English becomes glorified. English is seen as this wonderful language with more words than any other language. This is very silly stuff, actually, if you think about it. And it's constantly replayed, particularly in public discourse. And meanwhile, what I was writing about, the idea of the colonial other, and what I was trying to say is it doesn't just apply to people who've been or in a formal colonial context. It applied then to Japanese, to Chinese, and so on. So the other of English language teaching is then portrayed not in a simplistically negative way. As we know from colonial discourse, it's not simply the colonized people in the colonial relationship are simply seen as inherently negative, but they're stereotyped in a whole set of ways. And I was arguing that emerged from colonial ways of thinking, and that what we saw then, and I made that divide that some other people have taken up between teaching English and speakers of other languages, this T and Sol, and saying that on the one hand we had this teaching of English, which was somehow glorified. English was this great language that everyone should know. And on the other hand, you had the speakers of other languages who were often seen in very narrow terms, often as passive, as slow learners, as denigrated in a number of ways, or simply stereotyped in very narrow cultural ways. And so it was that I was trying to get at in that book, and look at the ways this odd divide, and we see that replayed in things like native speakers and non-native speakers, which is something else I've just been revisiting in some recent writing. Trying again to get at this sense of what is this divide, and where does the idea of native speakers come from anyway? I'd really like to pursue that further, because it's left a bit of, I don't really know it's hard to find the origins of that term and how it's come to be used as it is. The next thing I moved on to, part of this was developing this idea of a critical approach to English language teaching, to TESOL, and I edited a special edition of the TESOL Quarterly in 1999, looking at critical approaches to TESOL. What I was trying to do then, and it felt to me I needed to step back a bit and think about how to develop this idea of what a critical approach meant. That ended up in this book. This is Critical Applied Linguistics, a Critical Introduction, which came out in 2001. And that was an attempt to pull all this together, to say, okay, how do we understand these different ways of thinking, of doing critical work in applied linguistics? We've had things like critical discourse analysis for a long time, and still going, and a very influential part of our work now. There's critical literacy, there's critical pedagogy, a whole range of these critical approaches to applied linguistics, language education, that field generally. What I needed to do then to think that through was, one, of course, say, what does critical mean? Now, critical is a difficult term. Sometimes it has negative terms. You're being critical. That's a rather critical view. More generally, though, we can see critical as taking a particular stance on things. When we talk about literary criticism or something, we're not saying it's necessarily positive or negative. We also have ideas like critical thinking. But I wanted to map out what I saw as that line of critical work that I wanted to take up. And to do that, I needed to distance myself a bit from the idea of critical thinking. Critical thinking tends to be a rather, how would I put it, rather liberal view of that tries to evaluate different opinions and not to take a stance on things. The critical tradition that I was drawing on, that you see very much in critical discourse analysis, critical literacy, and so on, takes a much more overt political stance, and it comes out of what's often termed critical theory, which is then linked back to what's known as the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 1930s, people like Adorno and Horkheimer and so on. That line comes out of a Marxist, a neo-Marxist line of thinking, and therefore it's inherently critical of social conditions. It says we can't just say, well, we'll just balance away everything up. It says, no, we live in a fundamentally unequal world, and we need to, we can't step aside from those things. We have to address those full on. Therefore, to take a critical stance is to be based in some ways a normative political position. It's not necessarily to say a Marxist position, but it is to take up a position about social justice that is in a sense a core of that argument. What I tried to do then was work through the different ways in which that gets played through in areas of discourse analysis, education, literacy, and so on. But I also wanted to make an argument that for me there are also slight problems with some of the ways that view of critical theory works, that it tends to be rather normative, rather confining in some ways. And I wanted to also suggest we needed to have a more, what I call a problematizing practice that draws more on some of the work of Foucault and others, that questions some of the terms in which we think about those things. That, I think, is always a bit of a tension, certainly in the way I think about critical pedagogy, critical applied linguistics, that I think we always need to be asking questions, problematizing the ideas that we're working with when we talk about language, about people, about pedagogy, about teaching. I always want to ask those questions, say, I don't assume I know what they mean, in a sense. At the same time, I also want to have that critical approach that relates these to questions of power. That was that project, and that was 2001. I then moved on, did a number of different things, and two books came out in 2007. The first was this one called Disinventing and Reconstituting Languages. This is an edited book I edited with Simfrey Marconi. That, in a sense, takes up part of what I was talking about, of the idea of questioning those assumptions. And these are particularly assumptions about language, and that's been part of the work I've pushed further. You can see part of that argument in earlier work, but I wanted to take it further. I started working with Simfrey. I'd met him, as one does sometimes by accident, at a conference, a group of us having dinner. And interestingly, someone just asked Simfrey, he said, okay, well, you're from Southern Africa, how many languages do you speak? And, we were talking about multilingualism and so on, and Simfrey just said, you can't count languages. And I was just saying, what do you mean you can't count languages? Of course you can count. How many languages do you speak? And Simfrey said, no, I don't think you can count languages. So I was fascinated, and I said, okay, I want to talk about this. This is a really interesting position. And so Simfrey and I started working and ended up, we wrote quite a number of papers together and edited this book together. And what we were trying to argue was really a need to rethink a lot of the ways we think about language, and to question some of these things about multilingualism, about the way we have this sort of enumerative strategy for talking about this number of languages, these people speak these languages, and so on. The disinventing, which was Simfrey's term, and it's, it's not always the best term, both of us will admit, but we also want to link it to the idea of invention, which is to take it back partly to the very real issues of the ways in which languages were invented, particularly in colonial Africa, where languages are kind of made up, but particularly by missionaries, colonial authorities, and they're trying to say, okay, well, we need to map the ways languages are used. You speak this language, you speak that, you're bilingual because you speak those two, and so on. And we were trying to look partly at that history of invention, and then to question the ways in which we could rethink language, and as we said, disinvent, and then reconstitute languages. We tried to make very clear that even though we were saying in a way that languages as commonly thought, and the ways we think about languages are, in a sense, cultural inventions. They're also very real in the sense that they have very real effects. So language policies, what goes on in language education, has very real effects on people's lives, their possibilities, and so on. But they are, in a sense, cultural constructs. They're made up. So that was part of that work we tried to do, and that's, again, a sort of continuing line of thought. I'll come back to that, I think, in a moment. Next, this book also came out in 2007. It was a busy year. This one called Global Englishes and Transcultural Flows. This, in a sense, with that Global Englishes, I was returning to some of the earlier work, looking again at the questions of English. Global Englishes, the Englishes, I was trying to take up that pluralization that's gone on with world Englishes and so on. But I wanted to also distance myself from that view that's looking at English in different contexts, Indian English, Singapore English, Malaysian English, and so on. That's not the focus of that work. And the global I wanted to use rather than world, but to link it to a more critical view of globalization. This book also came out of quite a lot of work I was doing over a number of years, looking at hip-hop. That started really by chance. A colleague of mine here at UTS, Tony Mitchell, gave a seminar looking at the global spread of hip-hop. I really hadn't thought about hip-hop. It wasn't something I was particularly into. But he was showing how hip-hop was taken up and localized in different parts of the world. And as I was listening to this, I thought, it's so interesting that the way that's happened, in a sense, as a comparison with English. So we've seen this global spread of English and then that localization of English. So in part I wanted to say, okay, I'd be interested to look at hip-hop as a way of looking at a different sort of cultural spread and then see how that relates to a language spread such as English. But it also seemed to me I wanted to tie those together and say, okay, how do we also understand that relationship between English and a popular cultural form such as hip-hop? So Tony and I actually worked together on one of these projects, and I did another one, interviewing a lot of artists, getting CDs and so on, and very interesting, wonderful time working with a lot of fascinating hip-hop artists, some in Australia, but also from a lot of other parts of the world, and also in other languages. I also wanted to look at the French, what I call the circuit of flow, that we sometimes make the problem that we over-assume the dominance of English. There's a very strong popular cultural and hip-hop culture. I don't want to say emanating from France. My point was that it in a sense coexisted with points in France, and particularly in Paris and Marseille, but a lot of the people there were also from parts of Africa and the Caribbean, in a whole mix of languages and cultures. And we'd see that then occurring in countries such as Senegal and Mali and Gabon, and also then in the Caribbean and in Quebec. And there's some wonderful work going on in Quebec too, looking at the mixture of languages and so on in hip-hop in Quebec, and particularly in a city like Montreal. So what I was trying to do there was, in part, to think about how we can think about ideas of localization. How does language and culture get localized? What do we actually mean by that when it becomes a kind of local form? And I wanted to get away from those ideas about focusing on that as a national, like an Indian or a Singaporean or Malaysian. I thought, no, it's got a much more local flavor to it, the way in which artists take up a cultural form such as hip-hop and say, okay, we're going to do this with it, and are they going to do it in English, or are they going to do it in Malay or Tamil or Cantonese or whatever? And that to me was a very interesting project, and I also tried to get a bit into the pedagogy of that, and looking at the ways in which we can use popular culture as for pedagogical purposes, and how what some of the dangers and advantages of doing that are. That was followed then by another book called Global Linguistic Flows, which also took up some of that work. This was another edited book. This was edited with Sami Alim from the US and Awad Ibrahim from Canada. And so we, three of us, co-edited that book called Global Linguistic Flows, and that was trying to pull on that same sort of work. I mean, there were a number of people doing this, and we wanted to draw them together and look at, in a sense, social linguistics and pedagogy and hip-hop. So we got studies from Hong Kong by Angel Lin, from Montreal by Melasaka, and a whole lot of others, Tokyo Mani, looking in Nigeria. Really fascinating studies, pulling together these ideas around localization, about the appropriation of hip-hop, around the ways it uses different languages and so on. So that came out in 2009. And then finally, I sort of stopped working on hip-hop to some extent. I still do some work, but that was a project for a number of years, and I got a lot of pleasure from that. But I sort of moved into some slightly different spaces, and particularly I've been looking again at these questions about how we understand language, and at questions of multilingualism, and really how do we rethink maybe what multilingualism is. My most recent book is, I've got a new one coming, but this is a book that came out in 2010 called Language as a Local Practice. Probably has the best cover of all my books. I was very happy with that cover. This is actually an image from a Nigerian artist, Yinka Shonibare, who takes particularly British, but also other European images and then remakes them in a particular way. And it's, I discussed that, and one reason I wanted that image was because I discussed in one of the chapters, and I thought it was very hard to make sense of without actually having a picture. So I got on the cover in the end, which I was very happy with. What I was trying to get at in this book, of language as a local practice, was to, in part, to focus on those three terms very particularly. It's kind of an easy phrase, like language as a local practice. But I want to say, okay, what do we mean by language? And that goes back to those questions I've already raised in these. But again, to say, what are we doing when we do language? And it seemed to me there was a lot of work that's been going on from a number of different people, but really pushing this idea of language as an activity. We've now got this word that's been used increasingly, like the idea of languaging. It's sort of because we seem to be missing a term in English, but language as an activity. So we're now saying languaging, and I don't use that term myself particularly, but I wanted to kind of capture that same idea that language, we can look at language as a system, as an abstraction, but it really doesn't tell us much if we want to understand what people are doing with language. I even wanted to get away from that idea. It's not so much that we have a language that we do stuff with, but almost that language is something we do. That then linked very much to the third term of that, which is practice. And I've been reading a lot. There's a whole field of work in sociology and so on, the idea of practice. What does practice mean? It's a very interesting, slippery term, but it becomes interesting in that way that you can see it as one way of looking at social organization. How is it we do things as sort of bundles of activities? And people are often quite careful there's a whole range of work trying to define ways of thinking about practice. But they're saying, okay, it's not just an activity, it's a group of things we do together. But it sits in that kind of middle space of social organization. It's not like the big abstractions of the social class and so on. And neither is it just picking up a pen. It is, in fact, the range of things like giving a talk would be a practice. And how does that get organized? What are the ways in which we do those things? And then I was trying to link that more solidly, because a lot of this other work is looking at practices, how we, baking bread, playing sports, so a whole range of things we do. I wanted to take it back into the field of language, so how do we understand language then as a practice? And I also then wanted to link to the idea of the local. And the local, again, is a difficult term, and I've been writing about this and trying to work through it. One of the problems is we sometimes just see it as global and local. The global is the big and the local is the small. I wanted to think about the local, particularly by bringing in ideas of space. There's a lot of very interesting work in areas such as cultural geography, critical geography, really interesting theorizing about space and how we've tended very often from particular philosophical positions to view space as a very flat, it's just the environment, the context, and so on. And they say, no, we need to understand a much more, a deeper interaction between humans and their physical environment. And so space almost becomes another social actor, we have society and history, which is time and then space. And when we look at that work, again, it raises very interesting questions for how we understand language. Because we've tended to use in areas of social linguistics and so on the idea of context, language in context. I started to think, I think context is a bit weak. We could do more with the idea of context. And so that's what I was trying to introduce, the idea of local and locality. How do we understand that relationship between this language use as a practice and the environment in which it occurs? I looked through a number of different contexts in that book. I don't want to go into all of those. We're trying to flesh out those ideas, but that's really what that book is trying to get at. So rethinking language again. And I think what that book does, and what a number of other people, there's a range of new work going on now, and that's what I'm linking into a lot more in my recent thinking. People like Jan Blomelt, in the Netherlands, Jorgensen in Denmark, Adrian Blackledge, Angela Crease in the UK, Monica Heller has been a long-term thinker in bilingualism in Canada. A range of people like that. I mean, Simply Makoni that I've worked with, and we're always in contact. Again, others in South Africa and so on. And trying to get at the idea of what Blomet talks a lot now about mobility. We need a social linguistics of mobility. We need to understand that we use resources rather than languages. We need to get away from this abstraction about thinking about Chinese or English or French or Japanese, but say, okay, what language resources do people have? What do we use from different languages, different genres, different styles, different discourses, and how do we kind of put these things together? Most recently, my colleague here at UTS, Emi Otsuji, and I, we've been writing about what we call metrolingualism. We're trying it out as an idea, where we're looking very much at language in the city. And again saying, we don't want to map the city and say how many languages are spoken in Sydney, but say how do people manage their lives in the daily kind of multilingual interactions that go on in the city, and how does that language use relate to the physical urban environment. So there's a relationship between, it's trying to see how language moves through the city, how people use these language resources. That's the sort of work I'm kind of doing now. We have another project, Emmy and I, looking at that. It's kind of difficult actually to find ways of looking at this sort of complexity of language use, but it's very interesting to look at marketplaces and a lot of different contexts where people are working together about the multiplicity of the resources. And then this also brings in some of the multimodality work too, that says when we're looking at these resources, they're not simply kind of linguistic items, but part of a larger set of semiotic resources we have that may be visual, spatial, as I'm using my hands and so on here. So that's an overview of what I've been doing. I don't know if it's a coherent body of work or different elements. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm still going. And I just hope this is useful for people who maybe want to try and understand the kind of work I do. And I wish everyone else success in their own work. And thank you for listening to me.